This is the time when you get to ask the questions that I hope have been banging around inside your heads since this morning's sessions began. So I'm going to ask one question of the panel, and then I'm going to turn the questions over to you. And it's really embarrassing when there's a sea of silence. So keep ready.
Won't be silent. Duncan will talk.
When you ask a question, please give your name and your university, and then ask your question. I'm going to start by asking the panel something that has bothered me for the last 16 years. And I'd like to hear your answers individually to this, if you could, to kind of clear your throats. Given all that we know about what works, why haven't we as a society in the United States been able to apply more quickly what we know, as if this were, in Dr. Fitzgerald's terms, a public health crisis, something like Zika or Ebola that demands immediate and forceful response rather than chipping away incrementally. Who would like to explain that?
I'll give a thorough explanation about that. 2 points. One, we have made a lot of progress, I would say. In the course of doing this inequality research, I talked about how the gaps between low and high income kids have increased. It's actually the case over the last 30 years or so. Low income kids have made quite considerable progress. Right? On this standard deviation scale, about 0.4 standard deviation gain over the last, during the early elementary years, over the last 30 years. The problem is that 0.4 gets juxtaposed against a 0.8 gain, right, for kids at the top. So it's not as though we're not making any progress. But it's what inequality is doing is just accelerating the gap, which is very frustrating. But you know, as to one of the things that I've done in the context of this National Scientific Council for the Developing Child, we've partnered, as you know, with Frameworks, which is a wonderful firm that specializes in how to frame messages so that you can connect with people. They're the ones that come up with this toxic stress metaphor and brain architecture and things like that. And when they try to make the case in different kinds of ways for early childhood programming, they come up against what they call the family bubble. Right? And the family bubble is that whenever you try to get people to be thinking about social investments in young kids, people default right away to, oh, that's the parent's responsibility. Right? And that's just a very, very, very powerful kind of frame that most people have in our society. That until kids enter formal school, what happens to them is the responsibility of parents. It's not the responsibility of government. And it takes reframing. You know, if you try to make an argument about vulnerable kids, about how kids are really in need of these services, you don't get anything. Right? Because people immediately think, well, that's the fault of parents. But if you make an argument in terms of, and this is what Jim and others have been doing, right? In terms of, well, those kids are our future workforce. Right? Those kids are the future productivity of this country. Those kids are going to be paying the Social Security taxes. They're going to be paying your benefits, right? In 20 or 30 years. And then people start to notice. Right? But there's just a very, very, very powerful kind of mindset that the public has against making investments at this stage in life.
Thanks, Greg. Is anyone else dying to answer that question?
Why don't we all just do something?
All right.
I'd like to give two small responses. One is an unfair comparison with Finland, but I want to make it anyway. As many of you have read the book, various reports about Finland, they do an excellent job of treating all the issues of children by saying who needs what, doesn't matter from what village or from what town, who needs what, when, and that will change over time. So the locus is on the child and that particular child's needs, never the tax base of the community. So obviously Finland is very small. Our problems are mammoth in comparison. But if somehow we could take the whole concept of revenue coming from the city or the particular region that the child is in, take that out, and I could not do that. So, and nor could any Congress that we now have. But if somehow that locus could be the child, not where they're from, I think we could have some real differences made. And the second is going to be very controversial, even more controversial. For many years, I believed that all we had to do was tell teachers the data, the evidence for what works and what doesn't work. It's been apparent that it can actually happen, and you heard that last night in Hillary Clinton's speech, that she believes in science. The idea that we would ever have to say that we believe in science is outrageous. I mean, I want to make a joke, but I can't make a joke because it's so serious. The fact that we should ever be in a position of defending science is unconscionable. And yet, we have had an entire century, a century of educational practices that were by and large based on loyalty to the particular method that a particular university taught. This is simply no longer acceptable. Harlan said something to me in the car about taking the gloves off. This is my moment. Take the gloves off. Find out what works, what is evidence-based. And you, like me, who know all the wonderful reasons for various methods, and there are good things about different methods, but we have lost so many children because a particular method was considered creative or constructive rather than looking at the specific needs of the child. At all purposes, in all situations, we need the best, in my opinion, the best professional development, based on the best evidence that we can bring forth from science, and based on the very different profiles of our children. There is no one size fits all. There is no one method. Our teachers need a toolbox and the best, most perspicacious, trained eyes and ears that we can bring to.
Thank you very much.
Maryanne, I'm optimistic that now that we believe in science, we'll soon believe in math too. And then from there, who knows? Who knows where we're going. Maybe. So you know, I agree with what the two before said, but what I would focus this time on is to say that part of the reason we haven't changed is there's actually a lot that we do know. We just don't have good conveyance systems for utilizing them to change the practice that's out in the field. And I really think that we have to think just wholeheartedly about just revamping the way we think about teacher prep and training the teachers. And I hope that I can get away with saying that, having been a public school teacher myself, that's where I got my start. So I went through a teacher prep program, and I know that they vary, and that you have different levels of quality in teacher prep programs. But for the most part, in a teacher, I mean, how many people went to a teacher prep program? You know, so, okay, so in a lot of teacher prep programs, you take a lot of classes in things like developmental psychology and learning theories, where you get to learn how mice and rats learn how to go through mazes and what to do to make a dog salivate. And learn other types of things too, like the history of education, which is all interesting and important kind of stuff to learn. I do believe that. And I think that it's I mean, you also learn about, you know, like how to memorize the names of dead psychologists, which I don't actually mind, because eventually I'm going to be one, and it's going to be nice to be remembered. But I don't think that that's actually what the stuff is that makes for good teachers. I mean, I think part of the challenge is that we think of teaching as if teaching itself were like an academic subject. When in fact, teaching is not like an academic subject. Teaching is a performing art. And we need to be thinking about teacher training as you would think about performing art. Could you imagine us training people for things that we truly care about, like football, basketball, the way that we train teachers? Or we put them in an auditorium and we give them a class on the history of the ball and the physics of its properties? You know, we would never do that. What we would do is we'd get on the court or on the field with them. We would manipulate their body. We would think about all the different skills. Amazing how much time football players spend running with their feet through tires. You're not going to do that in a game. But what it is they figured out certain kinds of micro skills that I need that player to have as an ingrained habit within their behaviors. We have never come even close to thinking about education in that way. It's impossible for a teacher to hold in her mind or his mind all the things that they need to do. They need to have habits that are built in. But the challenge that's unique to teaching is that the two jobs for which you have to overcome a lot of background noise and training is teaching and parenting. Because everybody, before they've ever become a teacher or a parent, has had many, many, many years of modeling to teach them what it's like to be a teacher or a parent. And if we were to really think about teacher prep, I think we would have to realize that we really need to be thinking about how do you create habits out of those little micro behaviors that are a big part of teaching, and how do we do that at a level of intensity and a level of thoughtfulness high enough to overcome all the years of them having seen it a different way. It's particularly a problem in early childhood education, so we're trying to train people on how to be teachers of 3-year-olds. When most of the teachers can only remember what it was like to be in a 3rd grade classroom. And then we end up with 3-year-old classrooms that look more like 3rd grade classrooms with smaller desks. You know, we need to, I think, really seriously rethink the way in which we think about teacher prep. And I think a big part of it is ongoing coaching. And that's the thing that I love the most about what they're doing in Boston, is the fact that they're truly supporting the behaviors. If you don't have a coach that's actually there with, like in sports, what they do, they practice all the micro behaviors, they make them habits, they go over game plans, and then they put them in the game. And then what happens after the game? They all sit down together and they go over film. That's what teaching should do, in my opinion.
Okay, I'm the closer, so I will echo some themes of my fellow panelists. I guess I think that the idea that we have in the U.S. that children are really a private good is a huge piece of what's going on. Greg alluded to this. The idea that parents have kids and parents are responsible to raise kids, but it's much less in the public domain. And having spent a little bit of time, I mentioned, in Europe, you see something very different. For example, in France, there's near universal pre-K. At age 3 and 4, kids go to École Maternelle. And you can really feel that the school's ethos is that the kids are being turned over to the school. And in fact, once you get to elementary school, the parents aren't even allowed to enter the school building except for special occasions. And so the parents take the kids to the door, the teachers come and take the kids into the classroom and work with the kids. And that, model has pluses and minuses in different ways, but I think the idea is that the state has a huge responsibility for children, and that the family does a part, and that the state and government and education is a big part of what government is supposed to be doing. So it seems to me we need to reorient a bit how we think about children as public goods, and that has 2 parts. One part is that it's actually in our interest, right? It's economically efficient. You do the cost-benefit analysis for these programs that several of the other panelists talked about. it saves us money, right? So there's that dimension. And then secondly, it goes along with American values, right? We believe that kids should have opportunity, and we believe many of us come from religious traditions where that's a big part of what we think. There's justice, there should be opportunities for all. So I think trying to build on that in a way that gets people to think of kids as more an opportunity for all of us to invest in our future could be important. And I'm excited by some of the new findings coming out in the last even 10, 15 years about the brain and about the value of reading. And I think the kind of program that the commissioner this morning was talking about, the Talk to Me Baby, I think it's a wonderful way to educate parents. So I'm hopeful that we can take some of the science, since we believe in science, and then help motivate the values, both sort of the actual values as well as the economic value of investing in kids.
Thank you all for those thoughtful answers. So now it's your turn. And if you would like to target your question to a particular panelist, please say so. We're going to try to get as many questions from the floor in as we can. And my inner German will come out. I have promised Carlson Beckley that the buses will run on time, and you will be on the bus at 4. First hand I saw up was over there, and we have a traveling microphone.
I'm Bo Weston from Centre College. This, I think, will tie together today's theme with the Shepherd theme. Our host at the outset of the day made the provocative claim that illiteracy causes poverty. Can the panelists, any of them or all of them, back that up and add nuance to it?
Who wants to take that?
You know, saying causation sets off buttons in academics. People haven't been randomly assigned to either be illiterate or not. There are certainly many, many associational studies, right? And one famous one by Don Hernandez looked at literacy levels in 3rd grade as it related to high school graduation and college attendance, and you see big differences in the high school graduation rate for kids who were proficient versus not, right? It's a correlation. It turns out if you do the same kind of calculation for math, you get a very similar kind of difference. But, you know, I think the way to think about this is kind of dynamically. What kind of jobs do we need to be training kids for 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What kind of skills? And if you look at the evolution of skills in the labor market, we've spun off a large service sector, right, which requires a relatively minimal set of skills. And if you look at, I used to, in 1968, I worked for McDonald's one summer. I was a cashier, and we essentially added up orders in our heads and announced what the total was, right? And now, you know, it's the cash register, or whatever it's called now, where you punch the picture. So a lot of the skill has been automated away. But, you know, the jobs that we should be training all kids for are the decent middle-class jobs that provide a kind of income that are going to support a family, right? And increasingly, those are requiring higher level analytic skills, higher level communication skills, and higher level teamwork skills. If you actually look at the growth of the highest paying occupations and look at the composition of those jobs, it's that kind of bundle of characteristics. And you know, I'm sure for a lot of your states, the Common Core has become toxic for political reasons, but if you look at the Common Core, they're learning goals, right? There are math learning goals and literacy learning goals, grade by grade, and they're really set up with an eye toward kids ending up high school with the set of analytic skills and literacy and communication skills that are geared toward what the labor market's become, right? And, you know, call it something else, but put in those kinds of learning goals. There's another, the National Research Council has put together a next generation science standard set of goals. So it seems to me that that if the goal, right, is to really equalize opportunity, if the goal is for kids to come out of our schools with the kind of skills that are going to qualify them for middle-class jobs, it's exactly those kinds of skills that kids are going to need.
I'm going to do a real quick one. There are two sources I'd like you to just to look at. One is called Literate Nation. It's by Cynthia Coletti. You could also say Coletti Hahn, but it's Cynthia Coletti. And she puts all the figures together, all those studies. It's a great meta-analysis. The second is the UNESCO report in which they state there are 800 million non-literate people in our world. Their figure is that if we could bring literacy to 180 million, we would reduce world poverty by about 12.7%. So this is an absolute estimate, oxymoron. This is absolutely what they believe. It is, however, an estimate. The last thing I would say is a tiny anecdote. I'm going to say it really fast. I didn't talk about my own teaching, but I began as a kind of a Peace Corps-like stint in what was going to be South Dakota, but it fell through and they sent me to Hawaii. It was so embarrassing. I had no political cachet at all. I know, going to Hawaii, yeah, right. But the reality was, I was going to a mission in which all the children were plantation worker, indentured servants. It was absolutely clear to me from that year on that if I could not make my children literate, they would remain in the indentured circumstances to which they lived. And in truth, that's how I left English literature for my profession. That was my knowledge. You know, there were no estimates. I saw it, I knew it, and I know it today.
Yeah, can I put 30 seconds on it? You can time me, okay?
No.
Time. So, building up on what Greg and Maryanne said, and the fact that I also do believe in science, I have to wholeheartedly agree with what Greg said. There's no random controlled trials, so from a science standpoint, you can't really prove it. However, set that aside for a second, there's a whole other science of something called locus of control. And the science of locus of control shows that people are typically more effective at whatever they're trying to do if they feel they are in control of it. If I feel like all the capacity for my success or failure rests in something other than me, that doesn't bode well for my success. But if I believe that I have some control over my own success, it increases the likelihood that I actually will be successful. And so even though I'm agreeing with Greg that you can't really use the science to prove which one is the chicken and which one is the egg, I can tell you this, my preference is that an educator would absolutely say that literacy causes poverty. And my preference also would be that if you work in the federal government designing stimulus packages, you would believe that poverty causes literacy. You know, so from a locus of control standpoint, on a topic where you can't really tell which one is the chicken and the egg, I completely agree that the direction you're picking is absolutely right for what you're trying to do. Because you have control over literacy, but you're not controlling poverty status in America. And so having educators who believe that poverty causes illiteracy means that you have educators who are looking for an excuse for why their children aren't learning. Instead of having educators who believe that they have an agency in actually changing the world.
Marcia, are you good? We've learned that there's nobility in working in Hawaii. It's important. Those were great answers. Thank you. Next question. In front, you in the stripes.
My name is Jean Marie Christie. I'm at Washington Lee School of Law. And my question's open to everyone, but it's particularly about Dr. Gilliam's presentation. And there was a lot of study about race in your presentation, but I was curious if there are studies about the socialization of children based on their gender and how that affects their behavior in preschool.
Yeah, there's a bit of research on socialization of gender, and much of it has to do with really, really young children, trying to answer the question of Do girls develop language skills more because they're innately more attuned to language? Or is it because adults interact differently with girls and talk with girls and interact that way, and with boys roughhouse and tumble more? And most of the research that I've read suggests that there's some suggestion for both, that the environmental factors probably account for an awful lot of it, and that what actually might be happening is a feedback loop. And that if you have a little bit of a tendency in one direction, then that tendency gets played towards, and then the other ones get played less to. And so if there's a belief that the girl is going to be more interactive, then we talk more with the girl, and then the girl learns a whole lot more language skills, and then vice versa. If we believe that the boy is going to be a whole lot more athletic, and we play with the boy more. But in terms of shifting standards theory, the classic example that they give is when you go to a coeducational softball game, and the boy gets a base hit, and then everybody politely applauds. And then the girl gets a base hit, everybody jumps up into a standing ovation and hugs each other, and tears start coming from all the members of the audience. You know? And in part what that's doing is it's showing an underlying stereotype and a belief that we have regarding gender. But it also probably is telling us that we're probably also in all likelihood interacting with children differently on the basis of that, and encouraging them to different levels on the basis of that stereotype. In the end, for something like this, it's like Greg had said before, it's hard to do real experimental studies on this, because you would never want to you would never want to do something that you think could potentially harm a child's long-term development and do it on purpose just for the sake of science. You know, so I think at the point that we're at right now, there's a lot of suggestion that it probably is both. It's probably very interactive. One of them, if it's biological, we probably don't have a lot that we can do to change that, nor should we even try to be changing that. But the environmental part, we can change that. And the stereotypes and the biases, we can, if we focus on them enough, change that. At least to the degree to give every single individual child their individual capabilities to be able to rise even above whatever gender stereotypes we might have for that child. Same thing holding for race. It's not a great answer, but it's the best I can do.
We'll take it. So, yes, you.
My name is Dominique Pierce, and I'm at Marymount University. So my question goes to Ms. Carlson. You talked about the education rate for marriage, and how, like, if you have higher education, then you're more likely to stay married and get married. But what if the two adults in the marriage, or even before they get married, have two different educations? So, like, one might have a higher education, like maybe they graduated college and they got their master's, but maybe the other one only graduated high school. What would you say the rate, or do you know, like, can you assume, like, what the rate would be for that, for them to stay married and not get divorced?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's not a ton of research on that, at least as far as I know. What I do know about is there's been a lot of work on the increasing what researchers call homogamy within marriage. So basically that means that like marries like. So it used to be, for example, that colloquially, like, the doctor might marry a nurse, right? That he would interact with practice or law school, and now the doctor marries the doctor, right? Because people go on through education together, and they're marrying later, and so they're more likely to find people in the educational or workplace settings where they're encountering similar people. So there's a lot more similarity now within marriage, and it seems that college education is really the thing that differentiates people who get and stay married versus less than college. So I don't know particular studies that look at someone with sort of graduate education and college and some college, but it seems like somehow the college degree itself is very important for perpetuating these kind of preferences for marriage, preferences for having kids within marriage. And so whether that's something about the kind of people that want to go to school, have the ability to go to school, persist in college in order to get that degree, or whether that's something about what happens in college, of the things that you learn and the kind of values that you either establish or get reinforced. You know, it's hard to say whether it's sort of causation or something selective about the people, but it does seem like the college degree itself is important, And the increasing similarity of people within marriage in a way means that the inequality then is only greater, right? Because if you have two college-educated or graduate school-educated people marrying each other, they're going to then have, probably, given that most men and women now work, they're going to have higher income, higher earnings than before, when someone with a college degree might have married, say, someone with less than a college degree. So it's a really good question. I think there's ongoing research that we could continue to do.
Okay, we're going to take one from the back of the house.
How you doing? My name is Zachary Thomas. Really loud. Thank you. I'm a junior from John Carter University. I just want to thank you all for coming out and giving all your research and presentations. I really enjoyed them. This question is directed to Dr. Gilliam. And my question is basically, how do we all as educators give African American children an equal opportunity and basically reduce their chances of expulsions? Because we look at that and we even connect that to their population's majority in the criminal justice system, as we mentioned that earlier. So like we link in on these dots, like what can we do to bring that down?
That's a great question. It's a complex one. People do talk about the school to prison pipeline, and increasingly now they're talking about the preschool to prison pipeline. And that's what this is basically about. When you think about expulsion, there's a lot of similarities between expulsion and incarceration in prison. You can think of prison as a place. Prison also means removing from society because I don't want to deal with you anymore. And that's what expulsion also means, removing from the society of school because I don't want to or I don't know how to deal with you anymore. And so I think part of it has to do with a collective understanding of the fact that it's not a good way to deal with children. We can't be throwing away our children in some cases infant toddlers. This happens in infant toddler programs too. I mean, it's a rough way to start your educational career, having already been kicked out of school before you even got to school. And so I mean, part of it has to do, I think, with just keeping a focus on it, but part of it I think has to also do in the vein with what Comer Yates this morning was talking about when he said that he believes that literacy causes poverty. And that's to realize within education, there are some forces that are probably at play that education may not have a lot of locus of control over. And it may be that implicit bias only accounts for some of the reason that there's disparities. But that is a sum of reason that we can't tolerate. And that is within our control. And so what we need to be doing more is, I think, focusing on developing truly effective, not just one-off classes that make us feel like we've covered the topic of cultural diversity, but truly effective interventions to help us understand more about the types of implicit biases that we all have inside of us. I don't have liberty right now to tell you about some work that we're doing, but we're doing quite a bit of work on trying to understand teacher implicit bias and the impact that it has with specific experimental studies. And we're hoping to be releasing some of those within a couple of weeks, and we're hoping to try to be building out interventions on the basis of that basically help teachers confront and see the implicit biases that are inside of them, even when it's not easy to see. And one of the things that I can say with foreshadow is this: they exist in all of us. And when I mean all of us, I mean they exist within us as white teachers, and they exist within us as black teachers, and they exist within us as Latino teachers. They might take different forms, and they have different explanatory mechanisms behind them, but almost invariably, they all harm African American boys. Coming from white teachers and black teachers. And so there's certainly, and one of the things that I'm glad about is that the fact that is true, because it makes it harder for us to say, the problem is those teachers who have these bad thoughts. When the reality is, it's really a system within all of us. If you're interested in this topic, does anybody know the name Jay Smooth?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Jay Smooth has a TEDx talk.
Yes.
Take a look at Jay Smooth's TEDx talk. I don't know the exact name of it. It was something like, and he's a hip-hop DJ kind of guy. And he has this great TEDx talk he did at Hampshire College a few years ago, along the title of something like, how I stopped worrying so much and love talking about race. And in it, he compares implicit biases to like plaque on your teeth. And that what you need is somebody you rely on that can tell you that it's there. And then you do need to, every once in a while, go get it removed because the course of everyday life puts it there. The media puts it there. It's not like a model of like vision, where if you go get the right pair of glasses, you'll never have biases again. It's more like plaque. And you have to understand it, you have to inspect it, you have to have people that you trust tell you that it's there, and then you have to like purposefully have it removed and realize that it will come back. And you'll have to go through it again. You know, and I found it really interesting to look at it, and he taught me a lot. I never thought I'd be learning so much about implicit bias from a hip-hop DJ. But he taught me a lot. Is that a decent answer? Or good luck to you.
Marcia's going to add something.
So, Maryanne.
It's late. I'm old.
So I want to take a totally different tack that completely supports everything you said, but looks at it from a linguistic viewpoint. So how many of you have ever had to read or know the work of Jean Chall in reading research? Does anyone here know her work? Years ago, she was the head of the Harvard Reading Laboratory, and she was just truly one of the most profoundly important reading researchers of the 20th century. She's since died. Right before she died, she called me up and said, Maryanne, whatever you are doing, the most important thing you could do for American education is to figure out why fourth grade boys who are African American are failing in droves. If you can do that, you will make one of the largest contributions that have to be made in American education. So it's not by any means that I have done anything close to what she asked for, but I have been involved with a group of researchers in Georgia State, especially Julie Washington and Ann Charity, and then in Boston, Chip Gidney. All these are names that some of you may know. These are wonderful linguists and social linguists. And some of our work together is showing that there are really important questions about how the phoneme awareness requirements when you read standard American English. Now you remember when I talk about dialects from a linguistic point, we're not talking about anything being better than the other. We're talking about two different ones that are close. Now if I put my jacket next to Greg, do you see how close this is visually? This is very hard to discriminate unless I had red. And red's easy. Same thing with your ear and phonemes. The closer the phonemes are, actually, the more difficult they are to learn and discriminate because they're so close. Same thing with all our bi-dialectical kids. And Ann Charity and Julie Washington are exploring what can we do about the phonological issues, the morphological issues, and the syntactical issues between two dialects. And the denser the dialect, the more difficult it is to read in this other dialect, which is standard American English. This is an issue, it's difficult, but we must confront it and do something about it.
Thank you. We have time for at least one more question. Is there anybody on the left side of the house? Yes, front row?
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Hi. I want to ask about poor old Head Start. I know that, the data says, well, it's kind of meh, and fade out, and so on. I mean, in fairness, with the income requirements, you're already dealing with a disadvantaged population. And, Heckman always said, you don't get the huge ROI unless you follow up with these crucial investments. We had one suggestion from Greg Duncan about integrating curricula, preschool, and school. But I wanted to ask you guys, Head Start is just sort of something we've got, right? It's something to work with. So if I gave you a magic wand and said, make two major changes to Head Start, what would you choose to do, if anything?
Well, number one, I would take most of Head Start money and move it into pre-K. Probably not what you wanted to hear. Pre-K is set up differently, right? It's set up with stronger teacher qualifications. Head Start has been a wonderful, wonderful program. Don't get me wrong. It was just the right program for the war on poverty in the 1960s. And for several decades, I think it was the best program that we could put on the ground. And having a program that's actually scaled up and making a difference, that's a really big thing. And there have been a number of studies of early Head Start program, not the early Head Start program, but of Head Start in its early days, where there are long-term follow-ups that do show effectiveness into the adult years. I think the problem is the Head Start model has become somewhat obsolete. It's teachers that don't have this high level of training. If you think about just the task of coming up with a good program, back in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, the comparison was not between Head Start and other center-based programs, right? There weren't any center-based programs for low-income kids. The comparison was with staying home with parents, right? Usually the mom. Back in the 1960s, low-income mothers had 8 years of education. They now have 12, right? They weren't working. Now they're working. Back in the 1960s, Head Start kids had 4 or 5 siblings. Now they've got 1 or 2 siblings, right? So the bar of being in Head Start versus being in the home was pretty low to do better than what happened if the child was taken care of in the home by his or her mom. Now, you've got, in the Head Start experiments, 10 years ago, half the kids who didn't get into Head Start were in some other center-based program, right? And more than half of the 4-year-olds were in that situation. So there's a lot of competition out there. And, I talked about curriculum, and Head Start only mandates this kind of whole child set of curricula, which have not proven themselves. It's not oriented toward academic preparedness so much as socio-emotional preparedness. I think in theory that might possibly be important, but we don't really know how to do that very well. So it just seems to me with pre-K, which has come in from the states, right, rather than the federal government, with higher teacher qualifications, with somewhat higher standards all around, we just have an opportunity for a restart on the way that we set up early childhood education programs. And so I just, therefore, would want a substantial amount of the $10 billion that we spend every year on Head Start to be channeled into the pre-K programs.
Rebuttal? Okay, I love you dearly, Greg. But for full disclosure, my dear mentor is Edward Zigler. He is the last living member of the Head Start Planning Committee, and he ran the Head Start program during the Nixon administration. And he proudly reports during presentations that he's one of the few people he worked with in the Nixon administration that didn't have to go to jail for the job he did. But in terms of like Head Start, I mean, there's certain things that I think you have to focus on. One, like Greg said, it started out as part of the war on poverty with a completely different kind of perspective and slant than what public education does. It does have a more comprehensive viewpoint on what the services are supposed to be provided because it was designed for children who are living exclusively in poverty. And so there's lots of health components and mental health and dental and family social programs regarding helping to make sure that the electricity is on and helping to make sure that mom and dad have a job and all kinds of stuff, and a classroom component. Now, I did the first meta-analysis of state-funded pre-K programs that was published back in 2001, and I've been following state-funded pre-K programs for a long time ever since, and comparing the two, what it is that we know about one versus the other. Some facts are this. We do have a nationwide random control trial of Head Start, but we really don't have we don't have a statewide random control trial of state-funded pre-K programs. And so you can't really truly, we have something close, we have regression discontinuity design, but it's not quite the same level of rigor. Head Start, it's hard to do a nationwide study of Head Start, because when we did do a nationwide random control trial of Head Start, in many cases we didn't see the impacts that we expected, and the reason why is because the control group, many of those kids, they got Head Start too. They got assigned to control, they went down the street, and they went to a different Head Start. And when you look at the Perry Preschool study that was started back in 1964 on Abecedarian, when these programs began, they were the only game in town. And so the control group was a clean control group. Now when you do these kind of studies, even though the random control trials, and we say random control trial is great and terrific, but in many cases we end up with contaminated control groups. And so it becomes hard to really be able to hold them to the same scale. When I did a study looking at 3 different models, Head Start, when states were funding Head Starts, state-funded Head Start models, when states do sometimes kick in money to be able to fund Head Starts, and state-funded pre-K, and 17% of the Head Starts in the United States, the grantee is a public school. So what do you get when you get a Head Start public school hybrid? And typically what you seem to get is the very best of both worlds with a hybrid model. And so if I could wave my magic wand, one of the things that I would be thinking about doing, and apologies to Dear Ed, is that I would be thinking more about what can we do to infuse more of Head Start's comprehensive services into the public schools? Because in many cases, the things that Head Start struggles the most on is classroom level components. But the comprehensive services, that's their strength. And yes, you don't necessarily get the same, bless you, the same kind of impact on looking at when you look at Head Start as a model with its comprehensive services, and then you hold it accountable for changing the things that pre-K is focusing on, which is solely educational outcomes, you're not going to get the same level of outcome because you have a model that's focusing on multiple things. But we never look at state-funded pre-K programs and hold them accountable to children's health outcomes, or parents' social emotional outcomes, or parents whether they have their electricity or not. We never take it in that direction, and in my opinion, it's an unfair direction to take it in. It's about as unfair as when you give a language test to a bilingually exposed child who's young and who doesn't do as well in English as other children that age do, and say, therefore, this child has a language deficit. When in fact, they're just spreading their language skills across 2 different foci, the Spanish and the English, if Spanish is the other language. Same things for Head Start. If you only look at Head Start among the outcomes that are only valued by public schools and avoid the fact that they do seem to have a lot of positive outcomes for health and especially dental, but you don't value those because that's not part of what the school is supposed to care about, I think you shortchange Head Start. What we should probably be thinking about is this: how do we create models where they work better together? If the Head Start program struggles with educational classroom components, and the public schools in many cases struggles with parent involvement and comprehensive services, why not find a way to be able to take the comprehensive component of Head Start and infuse it into the public school system so that they can focus on the things that they each one do the best without pitting them against each other so that one person, as if it's some kind of a governmental zero-sum game to try to figure out exactly which model is the right one and which one's the best one, because in the end, the only person who loses that is not a department, it's kids and families who could be getting the benefits of both of them together if we just thought less territorially.
So I just want to say the bad news is there were at least 25 people with their hands raised almost from the beginning who we didn't get to ask questions of. That's the bad news. The good news is that all these brilliant panelists whom you've heard from today are not brilliant panelists who sail in for a keynote and then leave. One of the wonderful things I have come to respect about the work that Harlan does and the Shep Corps is that these guys are going to be here tonight having dinner, and you will get a chance, if you didn't get a chance to talk to them in this forum, you'll get a chance later tonight when we get back here at 6 p.m. for dinner. To close off,
I want to say two things very briefly.
Harlan wants to say two things, and then Comer's going to say a farewell.
Okay. 4 minutes to 4.
Oh, okay, yeah, we know. You gotta go at 4 o'clock. When you come back tonight, well, first of all, these are not drive-by speakers. They actually stay with us. That's the point. You've answered. Secondly, when you come back tonight, go ahead and help yourself to the buffet after you find the table you're supposed to be assigned to. And if you have any question about that assignment, you can just ask us and we'll tell you where you're assigned. We're assigning you tables not because we want to control where you sit, but because we want you to sit in diverse groups so you can inform each other, okay? Secondly, if anybody needs a ride to the Hotel Indigo, we can provide some of those.
Thanks, everybody, for a great day. Y'all, if y'all want to step down, because we'll give y'all applause in just a second. Just real quickly, sir, on your question, I'd encourage you to look at 3 studies by Dr. Julie Washington, to whom Maryanne referred when she looked at Hart and Risley's study on welfare parents. She looked and saw that the differential was the educational opportunities that the parents had around infusing early language and literacy in their children. So her 3 studies would speak to that. Real quickly, the last thing I want to say, just a stunning presentation by 4 people here, and what we want to do is a shameless plug around their work here for just a second. And people have talked for generations about training teachers. The work is not about training teachers, it's about empowering teachers. I'll use a quote from John Lewis: to have teachers discover that they're the 21st century freedom riders, that they are going to take children to destinations that their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and back for hundreds of years never thought were possible, and those children don't think it's possible, and for new futures. And one of the things we do, so we have an online campus that's absolutely free and universally accessible. There's a child welfare group in the Netherlands that translates the Cox campus to Indian dialects in rural part of India where there's total illiteracy to help parents teach their children to read. But this is a completely free site. 11,000 teachers are training on it today. And so here's what you see is 30 seconds of interactions. One of the courses is called the No Zone, because we firmly believe that telling a child to be silent whose family has experienced generation silencing, it's child abuse. It's educational child abuse to silence the brain of a child who's desperate for language acquisition. So we take teachers through an entire day of what it means to be a child's conversational partner, what it means to seek connection with a child, not compliance. And like Walter said, we break down these transactions and show teachers how to do it. So we'll just show this 30-second transaction and how it changes a child's world.
Madison, you have finally arrived. You know, Ms. Evans was a little concerned that you weren't going to be here today. How are you feeling this morning? Good. Are you? Okay, let's do it.
All right, you didn't get to see the video, but there is a demonstration the first 30 seconds of the day around language, executive function, empathy, and persistence and grit to start a day for a child, and that's how every child's day should start. And that's a way of hopefully saying to all of us, social justice. You're in the hometown of Martin Luther King. If we had time, we would all join hands and we would be neurons that suddenly became connected as a brain if we were all holding hands right now, and we would all be jumping around because we have been charged by each other. But more importantly, when we were holding hands, we would be demonstrating an internal truth spoken by our hometown son, Martin Luther King, when he says, we're all tied together by a single garment of destiny. For some strange reason, I'll never be what I ought to be until you're what you ought to be. And you'll never be what you ought to be until I'm what you ought to be. We have 4 people here today, nationally and internationally around, for making sure that that single garment of destiny is available for every child. Please give them a great round of applause.